The forecourt was screaming, and so was my son. Not out loud. Theo doesn't scream out loud. He screams with his hands, both of them pressed flat over his ears so hard the knuckles go white, and with his whole small body folding down toward the cobblestones as if he could make himself disappear into the cracks between the stones. He was 7 years old, and he weighed almost nothing when I lifted him. And right then I could not lift him because he had gone rigid the way he does when the world becomes too loud and too bright and too crowded all at once, and there is no inch of him left that will let you hold him. I am his mother. I have learned to read the weather of him the way a sailor reads a sky, and the sky had just gone black. We should never have come. I knew it the moment the gates of Haraway Palace opened that morning, and the crowd poured in like water through a broken dam, hundreds of strangers, 1,000 more than I could count, all of them talking and laughing and lifting their phones over their heads, all of them moving in directions that did not agree with one another. A brass band was warming up somewhere near the colonnade, the same 3 notes over and over, sour and bright. Children shrieked. A vendor's cart rattled across the stones with a sound like a machine gun. And Theo, who hears every one of those sounds at 3 times the volume the rest of us do, who cannot filter the band from the cart, from the laughing, from the shrieking the way you and I do, without even knowing we are doing it. Theo had begun to come apart by inches from the second we stepped inside. My husband Daniel had taken our daughter Nell toward the souvenir kiosk. 5 minutes, he'd said. I'll get her the little flag and we'll find you. 5 minutes. The crowd had closed behind him like a curtain, and in those 5 minutes the forecourt of Haraway turned from a postcard into a furnace, and my boy buckled, and I dropped to my knees on the cold stone beside him and tried to build, with my own 2 arms, the only shelter I have ever known how to give him. Theo, I'm here. I'm right here, baby, you're safe. He couldn't hear me, not because of the noise, though there was noise enough. He couldn't hear me because when he goes under like that, words are just more sound, more pressure, more of the thing that is already too much. His eyes were squeezed shut. His lips moved without making any word because Theo does not make words, not with his mouth, not ever, and I have spent 7 years learning every other language he has instead. Rocking. The way his fingers flutter. The pitch of the small sound that lives in his throat. And that sound was climbing now, higher and thinner, the sound that comes right before he bolts. That was the thing that froze the blood in me, the bolt. Twice in his life Theo has run from a place that overwhelmed him, just run, blind, with no idea of cars or stairs or strangers, and twice I have caught him by a handful of his coat at the last possible second. In a forecourt this size, in a crowd this thick, if he ran I might not see which way. I might lose him in 3 seconds. The thought of it opened a pit under me so deep I could feel myself tipping into it. Help, I said, to no one, to everyone. My voice came out small. A man stepped over us muttering about people who let their kids block the path. A woman with a stroller swung wide around us and didn't look down. Phones rose and turned and pointed everywhere but at the woman on her knees. The crowd was an ocean, and we were 2 people drowning in plain sight of 1,000 swimmers, and not one of them saw. And then Theo lifted his head. I felt it before I understood it. The climbing sound in his throat caught, not stopped, but caught, the way a held breath catches. His eyes, which had been screwed shut against the whole roaring world, came open the smallest amount. And they were not darting. They were not the wild scanning eyes of a boy about to run. They had fixed on something. Something across the forecourt, past the legs and the strollers and the lifted phones, at the foot of the wide stone steps that climbed to the palace doors. I turned to follow his gaze, still holding the back of his coat in my fist, and I saw the guard. He stood in a tall sentry box of black and gold, or rather just before it on a low stone plinth that lifted him a head above the crowd. A ceremonial guardsman, the red wool tunic with its double row of brass buttons catching the gray morning light, a tall black bearskin cap, white gloves, a rifle held to his side with its butt grounded on the stone. He was utterly, perfectly still. Not the stillness of a man standing and waiting. The stillness of something carved. The crowd surged and broke around the base of his plinth like surf around a rock, and tourists leaned in beside him to take their photographs, grinning, throwing up 2 fingers, and he did not blink, did not glance, did not move so much as a hair. He looked straight ahead at nothing, at everything, at a horizon only he could see. And Theo could not stop looking at him. I have to make you understand what that meant. In a world that is, for my son, a constant avalanche of motion he cannot predict, a world where every person who reaches toward him reaches too fast, where every sound arrives without warning, where the unpredictability of other human beings is the most frightening thing there is, here suddenly was a human being who did not move. A man-shaped point of absolute stillness in the middle of the storm. Predictable. Constant. Safe in the one way that matters most to a boy like mine. He would not lurch, would not grab, would not loom up out of the noise without warning. He was the still center, and Theo had found him the way a compass needle finds north. The climbing sound in his throat dropped a half step. His hands came down from his ears, not all the way, just to his cheeks, but down. "You see him?" I whispered. I didn't expect an answer. You never expect an answer, and you say everything anyway because the not expecting is its own kind of grief and you refuse to let it win. The soldier, he's not moving, is he? He's so still. Theo's whole body had turned toward the guard. The rigid, folded shape of him was unfolding by degrees, the way I have seen him unfold for almost nothing in this world, for the spinning of a fan, for the long, still face of his grandfather, for the deep, unchanging hum of the dryer he likes to sit beside. Still things. Predictable things. Theo loves what holds still because what holds still cannot hurt him. I did the only thing I could think to do. I shifted us, both of us, an inch at a time across the cobblestones, toward the one fixed point in that whole heaving square, toward the guard. I did not know, then, what kind of man stood inside that red tunic. I did not know that he had already seen us. I did not know that behind a face trained for 15 years to show nothing at all, he had been watching my son since the moment Theo's small body began to fold, and that he had already made a decision that would, before that morning was over, stop the entire forecourt of Haraway Palace cold. Moving Theo when he is overwhelmed is like moving a frightened cat. You cannot pull. You cannot carry, not without his consent, which he will not give. You can only go where his body has already decided to go and become the railing he leans on while he gets there. So when his eyes locked on the guard, I did not steer him. I followed, sliding on my knees, one hand a loose loop on the hem of his coat, the other flat on the stone, while the crowd's shoes and strollers and dropped cups went past us at eye level, and I prayed nobody would step on his fingers. It took us 4 full minutes to cross 30 feet. I counted nothing. I only know we were swallowed and spat out by that crowd a dozen times. A man stopped square in our path to film the band, and I had to put my shoulder against his leg and say, "Excuse me, please, excuse me," 3 times before he looked down and stepped aside with a look like I'd insulted him. A tour group flowed across us like a river meeting a stone. And through all of it Theo kept his face turned toward the red figure on the plinth, kept inching, kept that throat sound from climbing back up, because the guard stayed exactly where he was, exactly as he was, and that was the rope my son was hauling himself along. We came out of the crush at last at the foot of the plinth, into a little clear pocket of cobblestone that the crowd, for reasons of its own, had left empty, a respectful arm's length from the base of the sentry stand. The way people leave a space around something they half believe might be holy. Theo sat down hard on the cold stone in that pocket of quiet and stared straight up at the guard, and for the first time in 20 minutes, his hands came all the way down off his head and rested in his lap. I will never forget the angle of that. My boy, small and folded and frightened, looking up, and 8 feet above him, a man like a tower looking out. 2 stillnesses that had found each other across the worst kind of chaos. I sank down beside Theo and let my own breath out for what felt like the first time since the gates opened. "Okay," I said, mostly to myself. "Okay, we're okay here. We were not okay yet, but we were closer. I want to tell you about the guard's face, because I studied it for a long time in that little island of calm, and it was the most extraordinary thing. It gave away nothing. Not boredom, not strain, not the faintest flicker of awareness that a woman and a struggling child had washed up at the foot of his post. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, and they did not move. A muscle in his jaw was the only living thing in the whole composed mask of him, and even that was still. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered, squared-off face that has stood in a great deal of weather. There was a thin, pale scar along the line of his left eyebrow. He did not look at us. He did not need to. I understood, watching him, that he had taken the entire measure of us in some glance I'd never even caught, and that everything he was doing now, the holding, the not moving, the deliberate granite calm of him, he was doing on purpose, and he was doing it for my son. Because here is what I noticed next, and it stopped my heart for an entirely different reason. A pair of tourists climbed the low step beside the plinth to take the usual grinning photograph, pressing in close to the guard's elbow, and ordinarily, I had watched him do it twice already from across the square. A ceremonial sentry will, at intervals, snap into sudden motion. A stamp of the boot, a sharp shoulder of the rifle, a barked word of warning, the theater of discipline that delights a crowd and reminds it to keep its distance. It is sudden. It is loud. It is exactly the kind of unpredictable explosion of noise and movement that would have sent Theo straight back into the avalanche, or straight up onto his feet and running. The guard did not do it. The tourists pressed in. He held. They lingered, took 3 photographs, made faces. He held utterly, deliberately still until they grew bored of a soldier who would not perform and drifted away on their own. He had swallowed his own protocol whole, the stamp and the bark and the show of it, and he had done it, I am certain, because he had seen what the noise was doing to the small boy at his feet, and he had chosen, without a word, without a look, to be the one still thing that would not break. I started to cry then, quietly, the way you learn to cry when you have a child like mine, and you have done your crying in public 100 times. I put my hand over my mouth so Theo wouldn't see and worry, and I looked up at that impossible, immovable man, and I tried to send him every ounce of thank you I had through the 8 feet of gray morning air between us. He gave no sign he received it. Of course he didn't, but I know now that he did. For a few minutes, 3, maybe 4, we had peace. Theo rocked gently, eyes up, his fingers doing their soft flutter, and the sound in his throat had become a low, even hum, the contented one, the one that means the world has stopped trying to drown him. I dared to think the worst had passed. I dared to picture Daniel finding us, and the 4 of us slipping out a side gate and getting Theo home to the quiet of his own room before the day could take anything more from him. That was when the herald's trumpet went off. I had forgotten there was a ceremony that morning, some changing of a watch, some procession, the reason the crowd had gathered in the first place. And it announced itself the way these things do, with a brass fanfare, sudden and enormous, 6 trumpets opening up at once from the colonnade not 40 feet behind us, a wall of sound that hit the stone of the forecourt and came back doubled. To you it would have been stirring. To my son it was a physical blow. Theo came up off the cobblestones as if the stone itself had turned to fire. The hum became a high, thin cry. His hands flew back to his ears, and his eyes, which had been fixed and calm on the still red figure above him, blew wide and wild and went scanning, scanning, scanning for the exit, for the gap, for the bolt. I lunged and got 2 fingers into the back of his collar, just 2 fingers. And Theo, all 40 pounds of pure animal terror, twisted against them toward the open mouth of the crowd, toward the surging thousand, toward the gates and the road and everything beyond them that could swallow a small running boy whole, and I felt my 2 fingers begin, slowly, to lose him. Theo, no, Theo, please. My grip on the fabric was sliding. He was strong the way panic is strong. The cloth slipped to the last seam, and I knew, with the cold, clear certainty you only get in the worst moments of your life, that I was about to be holding an empty collar and watching my son disappear into 1,000 strangers. And the guard moved. I did not see the decision in him because there was no decision left to see. It had been made minutes before, the moment he chose to swallow his own protocol, and what I saw now was only its completion. In one smooth, unhurried motion that somehow contained no violence at all, he brought his grounded rifle up and set it against the wall of the sentry box, and he stepped down off the plinth. A ceremonial sentry does not leave his post. I understood even in that frantic second that what I was watching was the breaking of something, a rule older than the man, the iron contract of the uniform he wore. There would be a price for it. He paid it without a flicker. He did not lunge at Theo. That is the thing I have told 100 people since, and the thing that still makes my throat close. A different man, a kind man even, a man who meant only to help, would have rushed in, would have crouched fast and reached out fast and said, "Are you all right, little man?" in that loud, bright voice adults use. And the rush and the reach and the loud, bright voice would have been one more avalanche, one more grab, one more piece of the unbearable, and Theo would have gone off like a struck match. The guard did the opposite of all of it. 3 feet from my son, between Theo and the open mouth of the crowd, between my son and the gates he was trying to bolt for, the guard stopped, and he became still again. He did not crouch over Theo. He lowered himself slowly, the way the minute hand lowers, down onto one knee on the cold cobblestones, until his great height had folded to something near my son's own level. He did not reach for him. He kept his white-gloved hands resting open and quiet on his raised knee where Theo could see them, doing nothing. He did not speak. He did not fill the air with one single sound. He simply knelt there, a wall of stillness, wearing a red coat. His pale gray eyes settled now, gently, directly, for the first time on my son's face, and he held. He had made himself, with his own body, into the one thing my son trusts in all the world, a still point, a thing that would not move. I stopped pulling on the collar. Some instinct told me to stop, to trust the impossible thing happening in front of me, and I let my fingers go slack, and Theo, free now, with the whole roaring forecourt and the open gates and the escape he'd been straining toward right there for the taking, did not run. He looked at the guard. The wall of red and stillness, down at his level now, close enough to touch. The white gloves resting open and quiet, asking nothing, grabbing at nothing. The steady gray eyes that did not dart and did not loom. The trumpets were still blaring. The crowd was still a 1,000-throated animal. But here, in the 3 feet between my son and this man who had turned himself to stone for him, there was a pocket of absolute calm, and Theo's whole frantic body felt the edge of it the way a man lost in a blizzard feels the heat of a doorway. His hands were still pressed to his ears, but his feet had stopped trying to run. The guard, very slowly, so slowly the motion barely existed, turned one of his open white-gloved hands over, palm up, and laid it flat and still on his own knee. He did not extend it toward Theo. He did not beckon. He only made it visible, an open, motionless hand, doing nothing, threatening nothing, there if it was wanted and not coming any closer if it was not. The choice, every inch of him said, is yours, small one. I will not move until you do. I held my breath. I think the few people near enough to see were holding theirs too. A hush had begun to spread out from us through the nearest ranks of the crowd, a strange ring of quiet in the middle of the fanfare, the way water stills around a stone. Theo took one hand off his ear. He reached out, not fast, not all at once, but in the careful, testing, stop and start way he reaches for anything new. A hand floating forward and pausing, floating and pausing, and the guard did not move a muscle to meet him, did not close the distance by even a breath, just held that open palm steady as a stone shelf, and let my son come the whole way himself. Theo's small fingers settled onto the white glove. And the guard, who had not moved, did the one tiny thing he allowed himself. He closed his hand around my son's, gently, completely, the way you'd close a hand around something that might fly away, and he held it. Still, warm, unmoving. A grip my son could trust because it would not jerk, would not yank, would not turn into one more thing that hurt. Theo's other hand came down from his ear. The high, thin cry in his throat dropped and dropped again, and softened into the low, even hum, the contented one. His shoulders, which had been up around his jaw, came down. His eyes, which had been blown wide and wild, settled on the guard's steady gray ones and stayed there, anchored, the way a boat that has been dragging finally feels its anchor catch. The trumpets blew on, the crowd surged. And in the middle of all of it, my son sat on the cobblestones of Haraway Palace with his hand inside the white glove of a kneeling guardsman, and he was calm. He was calm because a man had understood, without being told, without a single word passing between them, that the kindest thing he could possibly do for a drowning boy was to be the one solid thing he could hold on to, and had been willing to break the proudest rule of his life to do it. I realized I was kneeling there with both hands pressed over my own mouth, and that I had stopped breathing entirely, and that down both sides of my face the tears were running free now, and I did not care who filmed them. The guard had not so much as glanced at me. His whole world in that moment was a 7-year-old boy and a held hand. But I saw the corner of his weathered mouth, that mouth that gave away nothing, move the smallest fraction. Not a smile, something more careful than a smile, the expression of a man who has done a difficult thing correctly and knows it is not finished yet. Because it was not finished, we still had to get Theo out of that forecourt, and we were about to find out exactly what it costs a man to leave his post. He came across the cobblestones fast, an older man, peaked cap, a long dark coat over the same uniform, the silver braid of rank bright on his shoulders. An officer. The set of his jaw said he had seen one of his sentries kneeling on the ground in the middle of a state ceremony, with a rifle leaned abandoned against the sentry box, and that there was going to be an accounting for it. I have spent enough years watching people decide what my son is: a nuisance, a spectacle, a problem to be managed off the premises, that I knew the shape of what was coming, and I felt the old familiar dread climb my spine. The officer stopped a few feet from us. He took it in, the kneeling guard, the leaned rifle, the small boy with his hand inside a white glove, the weeping mother. I braced for the bark, the order, the cold instruction that we would need to move along now, madam. The guard spoke for the first time. He did not turn his head. Turning his head would have moved his face out of my son's anchored gaze, and he would not do that. He spoke low, barely above the level of the crowd, his eyes never leaving Theo's. The boy is overwhelmed, sir. He cannot be rushed. If we are quiet and slow, he will walk out on his own. There was a silence between the two men that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and felt like an hour. The officer looked at the guard. He looked at Theo, really looked, the way the 1,000 others in that forecourt had not. He looked at the small hand resting trustingly inside the white glove, and the calm that had spread out from the two of them in a ring through the nearest crowd, and at the trumpets dying away behind us, the ceremony already over, already gone on without its missing sentry. And the officer did a thing I will be grateful for until the day I die. He straightened up, turned smartly on his heel to face the crowd, and in a parade ground voice that cut clean through the babble he called out, "Make way, please, make way. Give them room." And he began with broad sweeps of his arms to part the crowd, not to move us along, but to open a path, a clear, quiet lane through the press of bodies, all the way to the nearest gate. Then he stepped back and he said to the guard quietly, "Take your time, Sergeant Vance. Walk him out. I have your post." And to my astonishment, the officer himself walked the 8 feet to the sentry box, took up a position before it, and stood at attention, immaculate, covering the empty post of the man who had left it, so that no rule in the end would actually be broken. The post would be held. It would just be held by a different man for a few minutes while the first one did something that mattered more. I have thought about that a great deal since. I had braced my whole self for an institution that would see my son as a disruption. What I got instead was an institution that, when it understood what was actually happening at the foot of one of its sentry boxes, closed ranks not against us but around us. The officer holding the post, the guard holding my son's hand, two men of that hard, disciplined world bending the whole machine of it quietly to get one frightened boy safely to a gate. "Theo," I said, soft and even the way I have learned, "we're going to walk now. The soldier's going to walk with us, slow." Sergeant Vance rose from his knee the way he had lowered onto it, so slowly the motion barely existed, never letting go of Theo's hand, never breaking the steady gray anchor of his gaze until he was upright again and Theo was looking up at him from below. Then, gently, the guard took the first step. One. He stopped. He waited. He let Theo feel that the still thing, the safe thing, would move only as much as Theo was ready for it to move, and not 1 inch more. Theo took a step. And so we crossed the forecourt of Haraway Palace, the three of us, at the pace of a frightened 7-year-old boy, one careful step, one pause, one more. Down the clear, quiet lane the officer had opened through 1,000 strangers. The crowd, which moments before had been an avalanche, had gone almost silent. Hundreds of people stood pressed back on either side of that lane, and they watched, and they did the most beautiful thing. They stayed still. They stilled themselves for him. A man near the front had his phone up, but lowered it slowly to his side, as if he had decided some moments are not for filming. A child Theo's own age, held up on a father's shoulders, went quiet and just watched. The whole forecourt seemed to understand, the way the officer had understood, the way Sergeant Vance had understood from the very first minute, that a small boy who could not bear the noise was being walked, hand in white glove, through the eye of a storm that the people themselves were holding back by the simple grace of standing still. Halfway down the lane I saw Daniel. He was at the edge of the crowd with Nell on his hip, the little paper flag still clutched in her fist, and his face, I will never forget his face. He had come back to where he'd left us and found us gone, and he had been pushing through that crowd in a rising panic, calling our names, doing the math every parent of a child like ours has done in a nightmare. And then he had come around the end of oppressive bodies and seen it. His son, the boy who flinches from a hand on the shoulder, walking calm and trusting through the open palace forecourt with his small hand swallowed up in the white glove of a kneeling no longer guardsman. Daniel put his free hand over his mouth and stood absolutely still, and I understood that he had grasped, in 1 second, everything it had taken me half an hour to live. We reached the gate. The noise of the forecourt fell behind us into the quieter air of the long shaded archway, and I felt Theo's hand, still inside the white glove, give the smallest squeeze, the way he squeezes mine when the worst of a thing has passed, and he is coming back up into the world. It was time to let go. I knew it. The guard knew it. We had reached the edge of the storm, and a sentry cannot walk a family all the way home, but you do not simply drop the hand of a boy like mine. The letting go is its own delicate thing, and I opened my mouth to coach it, to explain to Theo that the soldier had to go back now. And Sergeant Vance, who had not spoken a word to my son this entire time, who had understood that words were just more noise, did something better than any word. He knelt down one last time, slow as the minute hand. He brought his free white-gloved hand up and laid it flat against his own chest, over the brass buttons over his heart, and held it there a moment still. Then he turned that same hand over, open and empty, toward Theo, the same gesture he had made at the foot of the plinth, the offered stillness, the choice is yours, and he waited. I did not know what he meant by it, but Theo did. My son lifted his own small hand and laid it flat against his own chest, over his own heart, copying the guard exactly, and then he turned it over open, toward the man. The two of them sat there in the mouth of the archway with their open hands held out toward one another across a foot of cool air, not touching now, just offering, and I understood at last what Sergeant Vance had given my son in that wordless language. Not goodbye. Something steadier than goodbye. A way to say I am still here even when the hand lets go. A way to say the still thing does not vanish. It stays inside where you can find it again. Theo, who does not make words, who has never once in 7 years given me a thing I could call a goodbye, gave one to a stranger in a red coat. He gave it with his whole open hand over his own heart. And then he let go. He turned all on his own and reached up for me, and I gathered him in, and his weight came against me without any of the rigid resistance of an hour before, just a tired boy, leaning on his mother, the storm gone out of him. Over the top of his head I looked at Sergeant Vance, and for the first time the guard looked back at me directly and held my eyes and gave me the smallest nod. There was nothing in it that asked for thanks. There was only one professional handing, a precious thing, safely back to the person it belonged to. Then he rose, slow and complete, and turned, and walked back up the opened lane toward his post and his leaned rifle and his waiting officer, the red of his tunic narrowing away into the bright noise of the forecourt, and he did not look back, because looking back was not the kind of man he was. Daniel reached us. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped the 3 of us, 4, with Nell and her paper flag, into one knot of arms in the shade of the archway, and we stood there a while and breathed. I have gone back to find out what I could in the months since, because I needed to understand the man. It was not easy. That world does not hand out its names freely, and Sergeant Vance, I came to learn, would have been the last man on earth to want a story told about him. But a few things reached me. That he had served a long time in places that ask everything of a man and give the calm back to him in exchange. That the granite stillness I had read as discipline was also something harder one, a quiet a man builds in himself after he has lived through enough noise. That he had a reputation in his regiment as the steadiest hand they had, the one they put on the worst posts on the worst days. And that when his officer was asked, later, why he had let a sentry leave his post in the middle of a state ceremony, why he had not put him on a charge for it, the officer was said to have answered simply, because he saw something the rest of us missed, and a guard who'll break for the right reason is the only kind worth keeping. They did not discipline him. They held his post for him, and then they gave it back. That is the part I most want people to understand, because it is the part I least expected. I have spent Theo's whole life braced against a world I assumed would have no room in it for a boy who comes apart at a trumpet blast, a hard, fast, loud world that would see only the inconvenience of him. And what I met that morning in the middle of the loudest, hardest, most crowded place I have ever stood was the opposite. I met a man whose entire life is built on rules, who broke the proudest one without hesitation the instant it stood between him and a frightened child, and I met an institution that, when it understood why, did not punish the breaking but quietly made room for it. The discipline was never the enemy of the kindness. The discipline was what made the kindness so steady, so trustworthy, so safe. A man who has trained himself for 15 years to be still under pressure turns out to be exactly the man a boy like mine can hold on to. Theo is calmer now in crowded places than he was. Not cured, there is nothing to cure, only a different way of being in a loud world but steadier. When it gets to be too much, when the avalanche starts to come down, I have watched him do a thing I did not teach him. He stops. He stands very still, stiller than the chaos around him, and he lays his own small hand flat against his own chest, over his heart, the way the guard taught him without a single word. He has found, inside himself, the one still point a man in a red coat showed him he could carry. I don't know that he could explain it. I don't know that he needs to. He found the calm he could trust, and then he learned to become a little of it himself. We went back to Haraway once, the following spring, on a quiet morning with no ceremony and almost no crowd. I wanted Theo to see the forecourt gentle. And there, before the same sentry box on the same low plinth, stood Sergeant Vance, still, immaculate, eyes forward on a horizon only he could see, a wall of red and discipline that gave nothing away. Theo walked up to the foot of the plinth, all on his own. He looked up at the guard for a long moment, and then, very deliberately, he laid his hand flat against his own chest, over his heart, and held it there. He could not have known if the man even remembered. A guardsman sees 10,000 faces a year. But Sergeant Vance, who does not move, who does not speak, who gives nothing away, looked straight ahead at his far horizon and brought one white-gloved hand up, slow as the minute hand, and laid it flat against his own chest, over the brass buttons, over his heart, and held it there. 2 stillnesses, finding each other again across the quiet morning air. Then my son lowered his hand and turned and took mine, and we walked out of the forecourt together into the sun. And the whole way home he hummed the low, even hum, the contented one, the one that means the world, for now, has stopped trying to drown him. I will spend the rest of my life grateful to a man whose name I almost never learned, who never spoke a word to my son, and who taught him more in 20 silent minutes than the loud, hurrying world had managed in 7 years. He did not save my boy with strength. He saved him by holding still, by being, in the middle of the storm, the one solid thing a frightened child could reach for and trust would not move. And I have come to believe that is the truest kind of strength there is, not the power to act, but the discipline to be still for someone who needs the stillness more than they will ever need the words. The man who would not move, moved for my son the only way that could have reached him, by refusing, for once, to move at all.